The blood-curdling scream tore through the hushed crowd as Felicity Ormond's knees buckled beneath her, the wooden auction platform creaking under her trembling body. Another contraction ripped through her swollen belly as she clutched desperately at the tattered remains of her once fine dress, now soaked with sweat, and the unmistakable evidence that her baby was coming here. Now, in front of the 100-odd souls gathered for the property auction in Coolidge, Texas, on this sweltering July afternoon in 1875. "Proceed with the bidding," bellowed Augustus Fletcher, the wealthiest cattle baron in Lamar County, his beefy hand gripping Felicity's upper arm as she whimpered. $30 for this fine house girl, trained as a lady's maid with extra skills, if you catch my meaning. His laughter boomed across the square as Felicity bit back another scream. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few women turned away, unable to watch the spectacle of a young woman no more than 20 being sold while clearly in the throes of labor. But the men continued their bidding, some eager to acquire a servant who'd soon provide them with another worker at no extra cost. 35, called a pockmarked man from the front. 40, countered a voice from the back. Felicity's vision blurred as tears streamed down her dirt-streaked face. This couldn't be happening, not after everything she'd endured, not after her master had died and his widow had promised her freedom, only to renege when debts mounted. Not after the father of her unborn child had promised to return for her, then disappeared without a trace. Her hands gripped the rough wood of the platform as another contraction seized her. "I can't, please," she gasped, but Fletcher yanked her upright. $50. Called a gravelly voice from the edge of the crowd. The murmuring stopped as people turned to see who had raised the bid so substantially. A tall figure pushed through the throng, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. When he stepped into the clearing before the platform, Felicity could see him clearly, a man unlike the others gathered there. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality. The revolver at his hip gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the star pinned to his leather vest identified him as a lawman of some kind. $50, he repeated, fixing Fletcher with a steely gaze from beneath the brim of his hat. Fletcher's lips curled into a smirk. "Well now, Marshal Tucker Ainsworth, didn't know you was in the market for a house girl." "I'm not," the marshal replied evenly. "I'm in the market for justice, and selling a woman in labor strikes me as about the most unjust thing I've seen in some time." Felicity couldn't hold back her cry as another contraction seized her, more powerful than the last. Her knees gave way completely, and she sank to the platform, curling around her belly. $60, shouted a voice from the crowd. Marshal Ainsworth's jaw tightened. 75. Fletcher's eyes gleamed with greed. Well, seems we got ourselves a real auction after all. Do I hear 80 for this fine specimen? $100, the marshal said firmly, stepping closer to the platform. "And that's my final offer, Fletcher," the crowd gasped. $100 was more than most of them earned in 3 months of hard labor. Fletcher hesitated, clearly calculating his options before nodding sharply. "Sold. To Marshal Tucker Ainsworth for $100. He thrust out his hand. "Cash only, Marshal." With a fluid motion, Ainsworth withdrew a leather pouch from inside his vest and counted out the sum. As Fletcher greedily snatched the money, the marshal climbed the 3 steps to the platform and knelt beside Felicity. "Can you stand, madam?" he asked quietly, his voice gentle despite the hardness in his eyes. Felicity shook her head, another contraction already building. "The baby, it's coming," she managed before the pain overtook her again. Without hesitation, Marshal Ainsworth scooped her into his arms. She was surprisingly light despite her pregnant state, and he cradled her against his chest as he descended the steps. "Make way," he called, and the crowd parted before him. "What you gonna do with her, Marshal?" called out a jeering voice. "Take her to jail for disturbing the peace." Laughter rippled through the onlookers, but Ainsworth ignored them, striding purposefully toward a chestnut mare tethered at the hitching post outside the saloon. With careful movements, he lifted Felicity onto the saddle, then mounted behind her, supporting her trembling body against his chest. "Hold on," he murmured near her ear. "There's a place not far from here. We'll get you someplace safe." As they rode away from the town square, Felicity surrendered to the pain that racked her body. The rhythmic gait of the horse only intensified her contractions, but the strong arms that held her offered the first security she'd felt in months. "Why?" she whispered between gasps. "Why did you do that?" The marshal was silent for a long moment before answering. No child should enter this world with their mother on an auction block. His voice was rough with emotion. And no woman should endure such humiliation. They rode for what felt like hours to Felicity, but was likely no more than 20 minutes, the marshal guiding his horse off the main road and onto a narrow trail that wound through a stand of cottonwood trees. Beyond the trees stood a small but well-maintained cabin, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. "My sister's place," he explained as he carefully dismounted, then reached up to help Felicity down. "She's away visiting kin in Dallas, but she won't mind us using her home." Felicity had no strength to respond as another contraction seized her, this one so powerful she couldn't stifle her scream. The marshal scooped her into his arms once more and carried her into the cabin, kicking the door closed behind them. The interior was simple but clean: a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, a bed in one corner with a colorful quilt. He laid her gently on the bed, then hurried to stoke the fire and put water on to boil. "I've never delivered a baby before," he admitted, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "But I've helped birth plenty of calves and foals. Can't be that different, I reckon." Despite her pain, Felicity managed a strangled laugh. "Not exactly." "The same," she gasped, her fingers digging into the quilt as another contraction built. "But I know what to do. I helped birth my mistress's children." The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and effort. The marshal proved surprisingly adept, following Felicity's gasped instructions without question. He heated water, tore sheets into strips for swaddling, and supported her back when she needed to change positions. When she screamed, he didn't flinch or scold her for the noise. Instead, he held her hand and encouraged her with quiet words. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cabin windows, Felicity felt the unmistakable urge to push. "It's time," she panted, her face flushed and hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. "The baby's coming now." Marshal Ainsworth positioned himself at the foot of the bed, rolling up his sleeves. "Tell me what to do," he said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Through gritted teeth, Felicity guided him when to check her progress, how to support the baby's head, what to watch for. And when the final push brought her child into the world, it was his strong hands that caught the tiny, wriggling form. "A boy," he announced, his voice filled with wonder. "You have a son, madam." The newborn's cry filled the cabin as the marshal carefully tied off and cut the cord, then wrapped the baby in a clean length of sheet. He placed the squalling infant in Felicity's arms, and her tears fell freely as she gazed down at her son's perfect face. "Hello, my darling," she whispered, running a finger along his cheek. "Welcome to the world." The marshal busied himself with cleaning up, giving Felicity a moment of privacy with her child. When he returned to the bedside with a cup of water, she looked up at him with exhausted but clear eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'm Felicity Ormond." Tucker Ainsworth, he replied with a slight nod. County Marshal out of Paris, Texas, just passing through Coolidge on my way back from delivering a prisoner to Fort Worth. Well, Marshal Ainsworth, it seems you delivered more than you bargained for today. A smile cracked his serious expression. So it seems. He glanced at the baby, now quiet and nestled against Felicity's chest. Does he have a name? Felicity hesitated, then said softly, James, after his father. Her voice caught slightly. James Tucker Ormond, I think, if that's all right with you. The marshal's eyes widened slightly, then softened. It's a fine name. He cleared his throat. You should rest now. I'll keep watch and tend the fire. As the night deepened around the small cabin, Felicity drifted in and out of sleep, always waking to find the marshal still there, sometimes adding wood to the fire, sometimes sitting at the table cleaning his revolver, but always present, a silent guardian for her and her newborn son. In the quiet hours before dawn, when little James fussed for his first feeding, she found herself studying Tucker Ainsworth's profile in the firelight. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's growth of beard. His hands, which had so carefully delivered her child, were strong but gentle as he passed her a cup of water. Why were they selling you? He asked suddenly, his voice low in the dim cabin. If it's not too forward to ask. Felicity adjusted James at her breast before answering. My master died 6 months ago. He was a good man in his way. His widow promised to honor his wish that I be freed, but then the debts came due. She swallowed hard. I was part of the estate sale, along with the furniture and horses, and the father of your child. Tucker's gaze remained fixed on the fire, giving her privacy. A cowhand on a neighboring ranch. We were to be married once I was free. Her voice hardened slightly. He left when the cattle drive headed north in the spring, said he'd be back with money to buy my freedom properly. That was 4 months ago. I'm sorry, Tucker said, and she could hear the genuine regret in his voice. Don't be, it's not your burden. Felicity stroked her son's downy head. Besides, I have James now, and thanks to you, we're both free. Tucker turned to her then, his expression serious. Not exactly, Miss Ormond. Legally, I own you now. The words seemed to pain him. But I intend to draft papers of manumission as soon as we reach Paris. You'll have documentation of your freedom by the end of the week. Felicity stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. You would do that, for a stranger? It's the right thing to do, he said simply. No person should own another. As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the cabin windows, Felicity found herself wondering if perhaps fate had finally dealt her a kind hand in the form of a solemn marshal with principles as strong as his hands. Tucker Ainsworth had not planned to stay in Coolidge for more than a night. He certainly hadn't planned to spend $100, nearly 3 months' salary, to purchase a woman at auction, nor to deliver her baby in his sister's cabin. But as the morning sun rose higher in the Texas sky, he found himself reluctant to rush their departure. You need time to recover, he told Felicity as he prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of his sister's molasses. We can stay here another day or two before heading to Paris. Felicity nodded gratefully, cradling James against her shoulder as she sat propped up in bed. I would appreciate that. I'm not sure I could manage a long ride just yet. Tucker set a bowl of mush beside her on the small bedside table, then pulled up a chair. Paris is about 50 miles north. We can take it slow, stop overnight if needed. And when we reach Paris, she asked, the question hanging between them. Tucker considered before answering. I have a small house on the edge of town. You're welcome to stay there until you decide what you want to do next. The spare room isn't much, but it's private. Felicity's eyes widened. That's very generous, Marshal, but I couldn't impose. It's no imposition, he interrupted. And please call me Tucker. After what we've been through, Marshal seems overly formal." A small smile touched her lips. "Tucker, then." She looked down at her son, who had fallen asleep after nursing. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." "No need for thanks. Just focus on getting your strength back." The next 2 days passed in a surprisingly comfortable routine. Tucker hunted rabbits and gathered wild onions and greens to supplement the meager stores in his sister's pantry. He chopped firewood, drew water from the well, and even managed to wash some of Felicity's blood-stained clothing in the creek that ran behind the cabin. For her part, Felicity recovered quickly. By the afternoon of the second day, she was able to move around the cabin, even helping to prepare their evening meal while Tucker held James. The sight of the tall, serious lawman cradling her tiny son with such gentle care stirred something unexpected in Felicity's heart. "You're good with him," she observed as Tucker rocked James, who had been fussing after his feeding. Tucker looked up, a hint of color touching his cheeks. "I like children. Never thought I'd have any of my own, with my line of work being what it is." "No wife waiting for you in Paris?" Felicity asked, stirring the pot of rabbit stew simmering over the fire. "No," he answered simply. "There was someone once." She decided a marshal's wife wasn't what she wanted to be. He shrugged slightly, careful not to disturb the now sleeping infant. "Can't say I blame her. It's not an easy life." Felicity nodded, understanding all too well how circumstances could derail the most heartfelt plans. James's father said something similar about a cowhand's wife: too much moving, too little security. Her voice held no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance. "I thought love would be enough to overcome that." "Sometimes it is," Tucker replied, his gaze meeting hers across the room. "For the right people." Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who understood disappointment but hadn't surrendered to cynicism. The moment was broken when James squirmed and began to fuss again. Tucker rose and carefully transferred the baby back to Felicity's arms. "We should leave at first light tomorrow," he said, moving to check the stew. "If the weather holds, we can make good progress." Felicity nodded, already anticipating the challenge of traveling with a newborn. "I'll be ready." The morning dawned clear and mild, a mercy for which Felicity was profoundly grateful. Tucker had fashioned a sling from one of his sister's shawls, allowing Felicity to carry James securely against her chest while riding. "I'll be right behind you," Tucker assured her as he helped her mount his mare. "We'll go slow, and stop whenever you need to rest or feed the little one." The journey to Paris would normally take a strong rider less than a day, but with Felicity recovering from childbirth and an infant to care for, Tucker expected it would take at least 2 days of careful travel. He had packed provisions, including the remaining rabbit stew and cornmeal, and filled canteens from the creek. As they rode away from the cabin, Felicity felt a curious mix of emotions. Gratitude, certainly, for Tucker's unwavering kindness. Apprehension about what awaited them in Paris. And something else, a fluttering awareness of the man who rode beside her, leading the horse with steady hands. They followed the main road north, Tucker alert for any sign of trouble. The Texas frontier was still wild in many ways, with outlaws preying on vulnerable travelers. But the day passed uneventfully, the miles slowly accumulating beneath the horses' hooves. By mid-afternoon, they reached a small creek where Tucker suggested they stop to rest. He helped Felicity dismount, then spread his coat on the ground beneath a cottonwood tree for her to sit on while he watered the horse. "How are you feeling?" he asked, kneeling beside her with a canteen. "Better than I expected," she admitted, adjusting James in his sling. "Though I'll be glad to sleep in a real bed tonight," Tucker nodded. There's a way station about 5 miles ahead. Nothing fancy, but they have clean rooms and decent food." He hesitated, then added, "I should warn you, people might assume. That is, they might think we're married." Felicity supplied, a faint smile touching her lips. "I suspected as much. It would be the natural assumption, seeing us traveling together with an infant." Tucker cleared his throat. "Yes, well, I thought it might be simpler if we didn't correct that assumption, for propriety's sake. But I'll understand if you're uncomfortable with the pretense." Felicity considered this, watching as Tucker busied himself with checking the horse's hooves. There was something endearingly awkward about this strong, capable man stumbling over social niceties. "I think that would be wise," she said finally, "for propriety's sake." Relief flickered across Tucker's face. "Good, that's good." He stood, dusting off his hands. "We should reach the way station before sunset if we keep a steady pace." As predicted, they arrived at Willow Creek Way Station just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The establishment was simple but well-maintained, a 2-story building with a stable attached, situated beside a small creek, fringed with the willow trees that gave it its name. The proprietor, a stout woman named Mrs. Hobson, greeted them with curious interest as Tucker helped Felicity and James inside. "Well now, we don't often get families passing through," she remarked, eyeing the baby with obvious approval. "How old is your little one?" 3 days, Felicity answered, exchanging a quick glance with Tucker. Mrs. Hobson's eyebrows shot up. 3 days. Land's sakes, child, you should be in bed, not traveling the countryside. Where are you headed in such a hurry?" "Home," Tucker interjected smoothly. "To Paris." "My wife was visiting her sister in Coolidge when the baby came a bit earlier than expected." The lie flowed easily from his lips, and Felicity marveled at how natural he made it sound. "I came to fetch them as soon as I got word." Mrs. Hobson clucked sympathetically. "Well, you'll want our best room then. Has its own stove for warming water, and I'll bring up extra blankets for the little one." She bustled behind the counter to retrieve a key. "Supper's being served in the dining room, but I can have a tray sent up if your wife is too tired to come down." "That would be appreciated," Tucker said, placing a few coins on the counter. The room was indeed the best the way station had to offer, clean and spacious, with a double bed, a small table with 2 chairs, and a cast-iron stove in the corner. Tucker immediately set about lighting the stove while Felicity settled on the edge of the bed, unwrapping James from his sling. "You're a convincing liar, Marshal," she observed with a hint of amusement in her voice. Tucker looked up from the stove, his expression serious despite her teasing tone. "I don't make a habit of it, but sometimes a small deception prevents larger complications." Felicity nodded, understanding his reasoning. A young, unmarried woman traveling alone with a man, even a lawman, would raise eyebrows at best and invite scandal at worst. The presence of a newborn would only fuel speculation. "I appreciate your concern for my reputation," she said quietly, "though I'm not sure how much reputation a former slave can claim." Tucker straightened, his gaze direct. "You're a free woman now, Felicity. Or you will be, officially, once we reach Paris. Your past doesn't define your future." Before she could respond, a knock at the door announced the arrival of their supper. Mrs. Hobson herself had brought up the tray, laden with plates of roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh baked bread. "I brought some extra bread soaked in warm milk," she told Felicity. "My own mother swore by it for increasing a nursing mother's milk." She beamed at James, who was sleeping peacefully in Felicity's arms. "He's a handsome one, like his papa." After Mrs. Hobson departed, an awkward silence fell between them. The single bed loomed large in the room, an unspoken question neither was ready to address. "I'll sleep on the floor," Tucker said finally, placing the supper tray on the small table. "You and James take the bed." "Don't be ridiculous," Felicity protested. "You've spent 2 nights in a chair already. The bed is large enough for both of us, and we're both adults." Tucker hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and practicality. "If you're certain." "I am," she assured him. "Besides, we're supposed to be husband and wife, remember? It would look strange if you slept on the floor." A hint of a smile touched Tucker's lips. "Fair point." They ate their supper in companionable silence, both too hungry and tired for much conversation. Afterward, Tucker insisted on taking James while Felicity prepared for bed, turning his back to give her privacy as she changed into the clean nightgown Mrs. Hobson had provided. "He's a good baby," Tucker observed, gently rocking the infant. "Hardly fusses at all." Felicity smiled, settling under the covers. "He's been through quite an adventure already. Perhaps he's saving his energy." Tucker chuckled softly, then carefully handed James back to his mother. He removed his boots and vest, but kept his shirt and trousers on as he eased onto the far side of the bed, maintaining a respectful distance between them. "Good night, Felicity," he said quietly, blowing out the lamp on the bedside table. "Good night." "Husband," she replied, a smile in her voice despite her exhaustion. In the darkness, Tucker's low chuckle was the last sound she heard before sleep claimed her. Morning brought a new set of challenges as they prepared to complete their journey to Paris. James was fussy, perhaps sensing his mother's tension, and it took longer than expected to get him settled for travel. By the time they descended to the way station's dining room for breakfast, most of the other guests had already departed. Mrs. Hobson fussed over them, insisting on packing extra food for their journey and offering countless pieces of advice for traveling with a newborn. Felicity accepted the older woman's kindness graciously, though she noticed Tucker growing increasingly restless, his gaze repeatedly drifting to the windows. "We should get moving," he said quietly when Mrs. Hobson finally bustled away to attend to other guests. "I don't like the look of those clouds to the north." Felicity followed his gaze and saw dark thunderheads building on the horizon. "Will we make it to Paris before the storm hits?" Tucker's expression was grim. "We'll try, but we may need to find shelter along the way." They set off immediately, Tucker setting a brisker pace than the day before. Felicity didn't complain, understanding the importance of outrunning the approaching storm. But as the morning wore on, the sky darkened ominously, and a chill wind began to whip across the prairie. "There's a line shack about a mile ahead," Tucker called over the rising wind. "Used by the cattle drives. It's not much, but it'll keep us dry." No sooner had he spoken than the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, the gentle shower had become a downpour, and Tucker urged the horse into a careful trot, mindful of its footing on the rapidly muddying trail. The line shack appeared just as the thunder began to roll across the sky, a crude but sturdy structure built of rough-hewn logs. Tucker dismounted quickly, helping Felicity and James inside before returning to secure the horse beneath the small lean-to attached to the shack. The interior was sparse, but dry, a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow cot against one wall, and a rough wooden table with a single chair. Tucker immediately set about building a fire, his movements efficient despite his soaked clothing. "You and James should get out of those wet things," he said, not looking up from his task. "I brought your dry dress in the saddlebag." Felicity hesitated, clutching James close to her chest. The baby had begun to cry, disturbed by the cold and the sudden darkness. I need to feed him first," she said, her voice trembling slightly from cold. "But I can't, not with you." Tucker glanced up, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Of course, I'll go check on the horse." Take all the time you need." As he stepped back out into the storm, Felicity quickly unwrapped James from his wet swaddling and dried him with a corner of the blanket from the cot. It was musty but dry, and James soon quieted as she nursed him, his tiny fingers curling against her skin. By the time Tucker returned, soaked to the skin but carrying an armful of relatively dry wood, Felicity had changed into her spare dress and had James wrapped in the blanket. "The storm's settling in," Tucker reported, adding wood to the now crackling fire. "We might be here for the night." Felicity nodded, watching as he shed his sodden coat and hung it near the fire to dry. "You should change too. You'll catch your death in those wet clothes." Tucker glanced down at his dripping shirt and trousers, then back at her with a hint of embarrassment. "I didn't bring spare clothes." Didn't expect to be caught in a deluge. Without hesitation, Felicity reached for the blanket folded at the foot of the cot. "Use this. I'll turn my back while you dry off by the fire." Tucker accepted the blanket with a grateful nod, and Felicity turned to face the wall, giving him privacy to remove his wet clothing. She could hear the rustle of fabric, the creak of floorboards as he moved closer to the fire, and found herself inexplicably aware of his presence in a way she hadn't been before. "It's safe to turn around now," he said after a few minutes. Felicity turned to find him seated on the floor near the fire, the blanket wrapped around his waist while his shirt and trousers steamed on an improvised rack fashioned from the chair. His chest and shoulders were bare, firelight playing across skin tanned by years of outdoor work. A long scar ran from his left shoulder down toward his heart, and smaller marks peppered his torso, evidence of the dangers of his profession. Realizing she was staring, Felicity quickly averted her gaze. "Is the horse secure?" she asked, desperate for something to say. "As secure as possible," Tucker replied, seemingly unaware of her discomfort. "She's got shelter and feed. She'll be fine until the storm passes." Outside, the rain continued to fall, drumming against the roof of the shack. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the wind whistled through the chinks in the log walls. But inside, the fire cast a warm glow, creating an unexpected intimacy in the rustic shelter. "We should try to rest," Tucker suggested, gesturing to the cot. "You and James take the bed." "I'll be fine here by the fire." Felicity shook her head. "I can't take your blanket and the only bed. It's not right." "I insist," Tucker said firmly. "I've slept in worse conditions." "We can share," Felicity offered, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "The cot is narrow, but if we're careful." She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Tucker studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Are you sure?" Felicity nodded, unable to articulate why this felt right when by all standards of propriety it should have scandalized her. Perhaps it was the shared intimacy of James's birth, or the pretense of marriage they'd maintained at the way station, or simply the isolation forced upon them by the storm. Whatever the reason, she found she trusted this man in a way she'd trusted few others. "All right," Tucker agreed finally, "but only if you're certain." As the storm raged outside, they settled onto the narrow cot, Felicity with James nestled in the crook of her arm, Tucker beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance despite the confined space. The blanket covered them both, and the warmth of the fire combined with Tucker's solid presence beside her created a cocoon of safety Felicity hadn't experienced in years. "Tell me about your life before," she said softly as James drifted to sleep. "Before you became a marshal." Tucker was quiet for so long that Felicity thought he might have fallen asleep, but then he spoke, his deep voice barely audible above the rain. "I grew up on a small ranch outside of Dallas. My father was a good man, tough but fair. Taught me to ride, to shoot, to stand up for what's right." There was a wistfulness in his tone that tugged at Felicity's heart. "He died when I was 16. Rustlers shot him when he tried to protect our herd." "I'm sorry," Felicity murmured. Tucker shifted slightly beside her. "It was a long time ago, but it's why I became a lawman. Couldn't stand the thought of men like that going unpunished." His voice hardened momentarily, then softened again. "My mother and sister kept the ranch going for a few years, but eventually sold it and moved into town. My sister married a shopkeeper. My mother passed on 2 winters ago." "And you never married?" Felicity asked, curiosity overcoming propriety. "Came close once," Tucker admitted. "Ellen Whittaker, daughter of the county judge." A rueful smile touched his lips. She liked the idea of being a marshal's wife more than the reality. "Left me for a banker from Houston after I was gone for 3 months tracking a gang of horse thieves." "Her loss," Felicity said without thinking. Tucker turned his head to look at her, surprise evident in his expression even in the dim light. "Kind of you to say." Felicity felt her cheeks warm. "It's the truth. You're a good man, Tucker Ainsworth. Any woman would be fortunate to have your regard." A moment of charged silence stretched between them, broken only by James's soft breathing and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. "What about you?" Tucker asked finally. "How did you come to be at that auction?" Felicity sighed, the memories still raw despite the distance they'd put between themselves and Coolidge. "I was born in Virginia on a tobacco plantation. My mother was a house slave, my father one of the owner's sons, though it was never acknowledged." She felt rather than saw Tucker's reaction a slight tensing of his body beside her. "When the war came, the master's legitimate sons went off to fight for the Confederacy. Only the youngest returned, and he decided to start fresh in Texas. Brought a dozen of us with him, including my mother and me." "How old were you?" Tucker asked quietly. 13 when we came to Texas," Felicity answered. 17 when my mother died of fever. Mr. Lawrence, that was our master, he was kinder than most. Let me learn to read, even kept some books for the household slaves. Said an educated servant was more valuable." She paused, remembering the man who had owned her but had also, in his way, tried to prepare her for a freedom he knew would eventually come. "He intended to free us all in his will, had the papers drawn up and everything. But then he died suddenly, heart seized up while he was inspecting the fields, and his widow found herself in debt. So she sold you instead," Tucker surmised, a note of anger in his voice. "Most of us," Felicity confirmed. "Some of the older folks and the children she kept, out of what passed for kindness, but those of us who could bring a good price at auction." She trailed off, the memory of standing on that platform still too vivid. "And James's father," Tucker prompted gently. Felicity was silent for a moment, absently stroking her son's soft cheek. "Daniel worked the neighboring ranch. We met at church. Mrs. Lawrence was religious and insisted we all attend services. He was kind, handsome, told me he'd been saving money to buy land of his own." She swallowed hard. "When he found out about the baby, he promised he'd buy my freedom as soon as the cattle drive was over. Said he'd have enough money then to start our life together. But he never came back," Tucker finished for her. "No." Felicity's voice was steady despite the pain the memory brought. "The drive returned 3 months later. I asked after him. They said he'd taken his pay and headed for California. Apparently, the call of gold was stronger than his promises to me." Tucker's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers closing around her smaller ones in a gesture of comfort that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "His loss," Tucker said quietly, echoing her earlier words. "Any man would be fortunate to have your regard, Felicity Ormond." The sincerity in his voice warmed something inside her that had gone cold the day she learned of Daniel's betrayal. In the cramped confines of the lined shack, with rain beating against the roof and her newborn son sleeping peacefully beside her, Felicity felt the first stirrings of something she had thought forever lost to her hope. Morning broke clear and bright, the storm having moved eastward during the night. Felicity woke to find herself alone on the cot, James still sleeping soundly beside her. Tucker was already up, his clothes dry and back on his body as he tended the fire and prepared a simple breakfast from the provisions Mrs. Hobson had packed for them. "Sleep well?" he asked, glancing up as Felicity sat up and smoothed her hair. "Better than I expected," she admitted, carefully lifting James, who had begun to stir. "How far are we from Paris now?" "About 20 miles, Tucker replied, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "With an early start, we should make it by mid-afternoon." Felicity nodded, feeling a curious reluctance at the prospect. The journey that had begun so unexpectedly was nearing its end, and she wasn't certain what awaited her in Paris beyond the promised papers that would officially grant her freedom. As if sensing her thoughts, Tucker added, "My house isn't much, but you're welcome to stay as long as you need, until you decide what you want to do next." "Thank you," Felicity said softly, touched by his continued generosity. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Tucker waved away her words. "There's nothing to repay. I did what any decent man would do," but they both knew that wasn't true. Most men would have ridden past the auction without a second glance, or at most offered a token protest before continuing on their way. Tucker had spent a small fortune to purchase her freedom, had delivered her child with his own hands, and had treated her with a respect few women of any station could expect, let alone a former slave. They set out as soon as James had been fed and they'd eaten a quick breakfast. The trail was muddy from the night's rain, but the sun was already beginning to dry the puddles, and Tucker seemed confident they would make good time. As they rode, Felicity found herself studying the landscape with growing interest. Unlike the flat, dusty terrain around Coolidge, this part of Texas featured gently rolling hills and more abundant vegetation. Stands of oak and elm trees dotted the countryside, and wildflowers bloomed in profusion along the trail, their colors vibrant after the rain. "It's beautiful here," she remarked as they paused to rest the horse near a small creek. Tucker nodded, helping her dismount. "That's why I stayed. Could have gone to Dodge City or Wichita when I got my marshal's badge. Better pay up north. But there's something about this country that gets in your blood." Felicity understood. Despite the hardships she'd endured in Texas, she'd come to appreciate its wild beauty, the vast skies, the dramatic weather, the surprising tenacity of life in what often seemed like harsh conditions. "What will you do in Paris?" Tucker asked as they resumed their journey, his voice casual, though Felicity sensed the question was important to him. "Find work, I suppose," she answered. "I can sew, cook, clean. I've been trained as a lady's maid, though I'm not sure how much call there is for that in Paris. There are several prominent families who might appreciate someone with your skills," Tucker said. "The Hendersons, the Wilcoxes, Mrs. Judge Wilson is always complaining about not being able to find proper help." He paused, then added, "Though with a new baby you might find it difficult." Felicity nodded, acknowledging the challenge. Taking care of James would be her priority, but she needed to support them both. "I'll find a way," she said with determination. "We'll manage." Tucker was silent for a moment, then said carefully, "There's another option you might consider." "Oh." Felicity glanced at him, curious. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, is getting on in years. She's mentioned retiring several times. I've been putting off finding a replacement, but—" He trailed off, then continued with more resolution. "The house has plenty of room. You'd have your own quarters, the entire upstairs, in fact, and you could keep James with you." Felicity's heart beat faster at the suggestion. "You're offering me a position as your housekeeper, if you're interested," Tucker said, his tone studiously neutral. "The pay's reasonable, and as I said, you'd have your own space. No one in town would think anything of it. It's a common arrangement for a bachelor of means to employ a housekeeper." The offer was tempting more than tempting. It would provide her and James with security, a roof over their heads, and an income. And it would mean remaining close to Tucker, a prospect that brought a warmth to her chest she wasn't ready to examine too closely. "I'd like that," she said finally. "Thank you for the opportunity." Tucker nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Good. That's settled then." As they rode into Paris later that afternoon, Felicity was struck by the bustling activity of the town. After the relative isolation of the lined shack and the quiet of the trail, the noise and movement of the county seat seemed almost overwhelming. People hurried along the wooden sidewalks, wagons rumbled down the main street, and the air was filled with the sounds of commerce and conversation. Tucker guided his horse confidently through the busy streets, nodding to those who called out greetings. Many looked curiously at Felicity and the baby, but Tucker offered no explanations, simply acknowledging the greetings with a tip of his hat. His house stood on the eastern edge of town, a modest but well-maintained two-story structure with a wide front porch and a small stable in the back. A neat garden occupied one side of the yard, and several large oak trees provided shade around the property. "It's lovely," Felicity said sincerely as Tucker helped her dismount. "It's home," he replied simply, leading her up the steps to the front door. The interior was clean but spartanly furnished, a testament to both Mrs. Finch's diligence and Tucker's bachelor status. The downstairs consisted of a parlor, dining room, kitchen, and Tucker's study. The furnishings were of good quality but without ornamentation, and there were few personal touches beyond a collection of books in the study and a framed daguerreotype of an older couple, Tucker's parents. Felicity presumed on the mantel. Mrs. Finch, a thin, severe-looking woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun, greeted them with undisguised curiosity. "Marshal Ainsworth," she said, her gaze moving from Tucker to Felicity to the baby. "I wasn't expecting you back until tomorrow." "Change of plans, Mrs. Finch," Tucker replied easily. "This is Miss Ormond and her son, James. Miss Ormond will be taking over your duties when you retire at the end of the month." Mrs. Finch's eyebrows rose sharply, but she schooled her expression quickly. "I see. Well, I suppose it's high time I showed someone the workings of this household." She turned to Felicity with a critical eye. "Do you have any experience as a housekeeper, Miss Ormond?" "I was trained as a lady's maid," Felicity answered, meeting the older woman's gaze steadily. "And I managed the household accounts for my previous employer." This seemed to satisfy Mrs. Finch, who nodded briskly. "Very well. I'll show you to the upstairs rooms. You'll want to get the baby settled, I expect, and then we can discuss the particulars of the position." As Mrs. Finch led her up the stairs, Felicity glanced back to see Tucker watching them, an unreadable expression on his face. He caught her gaze and offered a reassuring nod before turning away to attend to his horse. The upstairs of the house contained 4 bedrooms and a small sitting room. Mrs. Finch showed Felicity to the largest of the bedrooms, which overlooked the garden. This was to be the mistress's room, the housekeeper explained, her tone matter of fact. Not that the marshal ever brought home a bride, but he had it furnished properly all the same, after he built the house 5 years ago. Felicity took in the room with appreciation: a large 4-poster bed with a colorful quilt, a walnut dresser with a mirror, a comfortable-looking rocking chair by the window, and a small writing desk in the corner. It was far more luxurious than any space she had ever been able to call her own. "It's beautiful," she said, carefully laying James on the bed while she removed her shawl. Mrs. Finch watched her with narrowed eyes. "The Marshal is a good man," she said abruptly. "The best I've known in my 62 years. I hope you appreciate what he's doing for you." Felicity met the older woman's gaze directly. "I do, Mrs. Finch, more than I can express." Something in her tone must have satisfied the housekeeper, for Mrs. Finch's expression softened slightly. "Well then, let's see about getting a cradle for the little one. I believe there's one in the attic that belonged to the Marshal when he was a baby. His mother sent it when he built this house, ever hopeful. That woman was." As Mrs. Finch bustled off to retrieve the cradle, Felicity sank into the rocking chair, suddenly overwhelmed by all that had happened in the past week. From the auction block in Coolidge to this comfortable room in a respectable house in Paris, the journey seemed almost impossible to comprehend. James stirred on the bed, his tiny fists waving in the air. Felicity lifted him into her arms, cradling him close. "We're home, little one," she whispered, the word feeling strange and precious on her tongue. "We're home." The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Felicity settled into her new role. Mrs. Finch proved to be a demanding but fair instructor, insisting that Felicity learn every aspect of running Tucker's household, from baking his favorite apple pie to the proper way to launder and press his shirts. "The Marshal likes things just so," Mrs. Finch would say, demonstrating the precise fold for the dining room napkins or the exact placement of Tucker's razor and soap on the washstand. "He never complains, mind you, but I know what he prefers." For his part, Tucker was often absent during the day, his duties as Marshal taking him throughout the county. But he made a point of spending time with James in the evenings, sometimes holding the baby while Felicity prepared supper or taking him for walks in the garden as dusk fell. "He's growing so fast," Tucker observed one evening as he cradled James, who at 3 weeks old was already showing signs of the sturdy build he'd inherited from his father. "Going to be a big fellow, I reckon." Felicity smiled, watching them from the kitchen doorway. "He eats enough for 2 babies his size. Mrs. Finch says he has an appetite like a field hand." Tucker chuckled, gently bouncing James when he began to fuss. "Nothing wrong with a healthy appetite. Shows he's thriving." He looked up, catching Felicity's gaze. "You look well, too." "Paris agrees with you." A warmth spread through Felicity at his words. It was true she had regained her strength quickly after James's birth, and the steady routine of the household suited her. But she knew it wasn't Paris that agreed with her so much as the security and respect she'd found in Tucker's home. "I'm happy here," she said simply. "Happier than I've been in a very long time." Something flickered in Tucker's eyes, a warmth that matched what she felt in her own heart. But before he could respond, Mrs. Finch called from the dining room, announcing that supper was ready. The day of Mrs. Finch's retirement arrived more quickly than Felicity had anticipated. The older woman had packed her few belongings and was waiting in the front hall when Felicity came downstairs with James. "Well, I suppose this is goodbye," Mrs. Finch said, her usual briskness softened by a hint of emotion. "You'll do fine, Miss Ormond. You've learned quickly and you have a good head for managing a household." "Thank you, Mrs. Finch," Felicity replied, genuinely touched by the older woman's approval. "I appreciate all you've taught me, Mrs." Finch nodded, then reached out to touch James's cheek with a gentleness Felicity hadn't known the stern housekeeper possessed. "Take good care of this little one, and—" She hesitated, then added more quietly, "Take good care of the Marshal too. He deserves some happiness." Before Felicity could respond, Tucker appeared from his study, carrying Mrs. Finch's larger bag. "The wagon's ready, Mrs. Finch. Your nephew should have you in Dallas by nightfall," as Tucker escorted Mrs. Finch to the waiting wagon. Felicity found herself contemplating the older woman's parting words. Take good care of the Marshal. He deserves some happiness. It was a responsibility Felicity hadn't explicitly considered, but one she realized she had already begun to assume. That evening, as she prepared their supper alone for the first time, Felicity was acutely aware of the shift in the household dynamic. Without Mrs. Finch's formidable presence, the atmosphere felt lighter, more intimate, just her, Tucker, and baby James in the large house. "Something smells good," Tucker commented as he entered the kitchen, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Mrs. Finch's recipe?" Felicity smiled, stirring the pot of beef stew simmering on the stove. "Actually, it's my mother's. She used to make it for the big house on special occasions." Tucker nodded, moving to stand beside her. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the wooden spoon in her hand. Felicity handed him the spoon, watching as he tasted the stew. His eyes widened in appreciation. "That's the best stew I've had since my mother's," he declared, returning the spoon to her. "Your mother taught you well." "She believed cooking was more than just putting food on the table," Felicity said, pleased by his reaction. "She said a good meal could heal both body and spirit." Tucker's gaze lingered on her face. "She sounds like a wise woman." He glanced around the kitchen, then added, "How are you settling in now that Mrs. Finch is gone? Is there anything you need?" Felicity considered the question. "Actually, there is something I've been thinking about." She hesitated, then continued, "The garden is lovely, but I notice there's no vegetable patch. Would you mind if I planted one? Fresh vegetables would be a welcome addition to our meals, and I've always enjoyed growing things." "Our meals," Tucker repeated softly, something like satisfaction in his expression. "Yes, I'd like that. The south side of the yard gets good sun. Plant whatever you'd like there." The casual way he granted her request, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for her to make such changes to his property, touched Felicity deeply. It wasn't just permission to plant vegetables. It was an acknowledgement that this was her home too, that she had a say in shaping their shared environment. That night, as Felicity prepared for bed, she found herself lingering at the window, gazing out at the stars scattered across the Texas sky. From her room, she could see the outline of the garden where she would soon plant her vegetables, and beyond it, the lights of Paris glowing softly in the distance. A month ago, she had been property, a commodity to be bought and sold. Now she was a free woman with a home, a position, and a future for her son. And though she was technically Tucker's employee, the way he treated her with respect, consideration, and growing affection made their relationship feel like something more. As summer ripened into early autumn, Felicity's vegetable garden flourished, providing fresh produce for their table and even enough extra to share with neighbors. James grew too, a healthy, happy baby whose laughter filled the house and whose antics increasingly delighted Tucker. He rolled over, Tucker announced one evening, bursting into the kitchen where Felicity was preparing supper. All by himself, from his back to his stomach. Felicity laughed at his enthusiasm. "He's been practicing. Soon he'll be crawling, and then we'll really have our hands full." "Our hands," Tucker echoed, just as he had with our meals months earlier. The phrase seemed to please him, a subtle acknowledgement of the family unit they had become, unconventional though it might be. Word had spread through Paris about the Marshal's new housekeeper and her infant son, and while there had been initial whispers and raised eyebrows, Tucker's standing in the community was such that few dared to openly question the arrangement. Those who met Felicity quickly recognized her intelligence and capability, and most accepted the explanation that she was a widow whom the marshal had helped in her time of need. Only Mrs. Judge Wilson, upon meeting Felicity at church, had dared to directly address the situation. "It's unusual, isn't it?" she had remarked with a thin smile, "for a young, unmarried woman to keep house for a bachelor, even one as respected as Marshal Ainsworth." "Perhaps," Felicity had replied evenly, "but the marshal is known for his unconventional thinking. It's what makes him such an effective lawman, don't you think?" Mrs. Wilson had been unable to argue with that assessment, and the subject had been dropped, though Felicity occasionally caught the woman watching her speculatively during Sunday services. Tucker, for his part, seemed oblivious to the town's gossip. His focus remained on his duties as marshal and, increasingly, on Felicity and James. He began to spend more evenings at home rather than at the sheriff's office, often reading reports in his study with James playing on a blanket at his feet while Felicity mended or knitted nearby. It was during one such evening, as autumn winds rattled the windows and a fire crackled in the hearth, that Tucker looked up from his papers to find Felicity watching him, a soft expression on her face. "What is it?" he asked, setting aside his report. Felicity shook her head slightly. "Nothing. Just, I never properly thanked you." Tucker's brow furrowed. "For what?" "For everything." She gestured around them, encompassing the comfortable room, the sleeping baby, the life they had built. "For buying my freedom, for delivering James, for giving us a home." "You've more than earned your place here," Tucker said earnestly. "You're not just a housekeeper, Felicity. You've made this house a home." The sincerity in his voice warmed her more than the fire. "Still, I want you to know how grateful I am. How much it means to me and to James to have you in our lives." Tucker was silent for a moment, his gaze steady on her face. Then he rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I want to be in your lives," he said quietly. "Not just as your employer or James's benefactor. I want—" He hesitated, then reached for her hand, his calloused fingers enveloping hers. "I care for you, Felicity, more than I should, perhaps, more than is proper for a man in my position." Felicity's heart raced at his words, at the vulnerability in his expression. "I care for you too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have for some time." Relief and joy transformed Tucker's face. "I've been trying to find the courage to tell you. Wasn't sure if you felt the same, or if you were just grateful, or if it was too soon after James's father." "Daniel is in the past," Felicity said firmly. "What I feel for you is different, stronger." She squeezed his hand. "More real." Tucker's gaze dropped to their joined hands, then lifted to meet hers again. "I don't want to rush you. We can take this as slow as you need. But I want you to know my intentions are honorable." A smile curved Felicity's lips. "I never doubted that, Tucker Ainsworth." The moment hung between them, charged with possibility. Then, with deliberate care, Tucker raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture both chivalrous and intimate that sent a shiver of delight through Felicity's body. "I should check on the horses," Tucker said reluctantly, rising to his feet. "Storm's coming in." As he donned his coat and stepped out into the night, Felicity remained by the fire, her hand still warm where his lips had touched it, her heart full of a joy she had never expected to find. The winter of 1875-1876 was unusually harsh, with bitter winds sweeping down from the north and occasional snowfalls blanketing Paris in white. But inside Tucker's house, their house, as Felicity had come to think of it, warmth prevailed, both literal and figurative. Their courtship progressed with the measured pace Tucker had promised, consisting primarily of shared meals, conversations by the fire after James was asleep, and occasional ventures into town together for supplies or church services. To the casual observer, little had changed in their household routine, but Felicity was acutely aware of the subtle shifts, the way Tucker's hand would linger when he helped her with her coat, the private smiles they exchanged across the dinner table, the gentle way he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when he thought no one was looking. James thrived despite the cold weather, growing from an infant into a robust baby who delighted in pulling himself up on furniture and babbling happily at anyone who would listen. His first clear word, "Ma," came on a snowy January morning, followed closely by "Tuck," which never failed to bring a grin to the Marshal's face. "He thinks of you as his father," Felicity observed one evening as Tucker patiently helped James stack wooden blocks in the parlor. Tucker looked up, surprise and pleasure mingling in his expression. "I'd be honored if he did," he said quietly. "I couldn't love him more if he were my own flesh and blood." The declaration, simple yet profound, settled in Felicity's heart like a promise. She had known for some time that Tucker cared for James, but to hear him speak of love so openly, so naturally, confirmed what she had come to believe, that the unconventional family they had formed was as real and meaningful as any bound by blood or law. As winter began to loosen its grip on the land, Tucker was called away more frequently to deal with the increase in criminal activity that typically accompanied the change of seasons. Cattle rustlers, emboldened by the improving weather, had begun targeting ranches in the eastern part of the county, and Tucker spent several days tracking them before finally making arrests. He returned late one night in early March, his clothes mud-spattered and his expression weary. Felicity, who had been waiting up despite the late hour, met him at the door with a lantern. "You should be in bed," he chided gently, hanging his hat on the peg. "I couldn't sleep until I knew you were home safe," she replied, leading the way to the kitchen where she had kept stew warming on the back of the stove. "Are you hungry?" Tucker nodded gratefully, sinking into a chair at the table. "Starving. We've been riding since dawn." As Felicity ladled stew into a bowl, she studied him surreptitiously. There was a new cut along his jawline, already scabbing over, and his movements betrayed a stiffness that suggested he'd taken a fall or been in a fight. "You're hurt," she said, setting the bowl before him. Tucker shook his head dismissively. "Just a scratch. The younger Blackwood boy put up a fight when we cornered him in that ravine north of the Wilcox place." He managed a tired smile. "You should see the other fellow." Felicity wasn't amused. "Let me look at it after you've eaten." Tucker didn't argue, too exhausted to put up his usual protests about minor injuries. He ate quickly, hunger overriding his customary table manners, while Felicity prepared hot water and clean cloths. When he had finished, she guided him to sit near the lamp and carefully examine the cut on his jaw. "It's not deep, but it needs cleaning," she determined, dipping a cloth in the warm water. "What happened?" Tucker winced slightly as she began to bathe the wound. "Ambushed us just before sunset." They'd split up, hoping to confuse our tracking. We weren't expecting the youngest to circle back behind us. His expression darkened. "He nearly got the drop on Deputy Harris. I managed to knock him off his horse, but he came up swinging with a knife." Felicity's hand stilled for a moment as she absorbed the implication that Tucker had nearly been seriously injured, or worse. "You could have been killed," she said quietly. "Part of the job," Tucker replied, his tone deliberately casual. But when he met her gaze, his eyes softened. "I'm always careful, Felicity. I have too much to come home to now." Her heart swelled at his words. Impulsively, she leaned down and pressed a kiss to his forehead. "See that you remember that, Marshal Ainsworth." Tucker's hand caught hers, holding it against his chest where she could feel the steady beat of his heart. "I do. Every day." In that moment, with his tired eyes looking up at her with such tenderness. Felicity knew with absolute certainty that she loved this man not just for what he had done for her and James, but for who he was. For his integrity, his gentle strength, his unwavering commitment to what was right. "Tucker," she began, her voice suddenly husky. A cry from upstairs interrupted her. James, waking from a bad dream as he sometimes did. Tucker released her hand reluctantly. "Go to him," he said. "We'll talk tomorrow." But tomorrow brought new demands on Tucker's time, as reports came in of the Blackwood gang's associates causing trouble in neighboring counties. For the next several weeks, he was frequently absent from home, returning only for brief intervals to sleep, change clothes, and spend precious moments with Felicity and James before duty called him away again. Spring arrived in earnest, bringing with it the riot of wildflowers for which that part of Texas was famous. Felicity's vegetable garden flourished once more, and James, now crawling with determined speed, delighted in exploring the backyard under his mother's watchful eye. On a particularly fine April morning, as Felicity hung laundry on the line while James played nearby, she was surprised to see Tucker riding up the lane. He wasn't expected back from Fort Worth until the following day. "Tucker," she called, waving a sheet in greeting. "You're home early." He dismounted with a fluid grace that still caught her breath, tethering his horse to the garden fence before striding toward her with purpose in his step. Something about his expression, a mixture of determination and barely contained excitement, made her heart race. "Is everything all right?" she asked as he reached her. Tucker nodded, his gaze sweeping over her face as if memorizing each feature. "Everything's fine. Better than fine." He glanced down at James, who had crawled over to investigate his boots, and scooped the baby up with a grin. "Hello, little man. Been taking good care of your mama while I was away," James babbled happily, patting Tucker's stubbled cheek with a chubby hand. Tucker laughed, then set the baby down carefully on the grass before turning back to Felicity. "I've been doing a lot of thinking these past weeks," he said, his voice taking on a serious tone, "about what matters most to me, about the future." Felicity's pulse quickened at his words. "Oh, I want to ask you something," Tucker continued, reaching into his vest pocket. "Something important." Before Felicity could respond, he lowered himself to one knee before her, right there in the backyard with the laundry flapping on the line and James attempting to eat a dandelion nearby. "Felicity Ormond," Tucker said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I love you. I love James too, as if he were my own son. I want us to be a proper family, not just in our hearts, but in the eyes of the law and the community." He opened his hand to reveal a simple gold band resting on his palm. "Will you marry me?" Tears sprang to Felicity's eyes, blurring her vision. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Tucker Ainsworth, I will marry you." Joy transformed his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. He rose to his feet, and with a tenderness that made her heart ache, cupped her face in his hands and kissed her for the first time, a kiss that held both promise and passion, sealing their commitment to each other. When they finally parted, both breathless, Tucker rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for a very long time," he admitted with a smile. "What took you so long, Marshal?" Felicity teased, her hands resting on his chest. Tucker chuckled, then grew more serious. "I wanted to be sure you were ready, that your feelings for me weren't just gratitude or convenience." His thumb traced the curve of her cheek. "And I wanted to have something to offer you, security, respectability." "You've always had something to offer me," Felicity said softly. "Your heart, that's all I've ever wanted." James chose that moment to let out an indignant squeal, having failed to capture a butterfly that had fluttered past his nose. Tucker and Felicity turned to find him sitting in the grass, lower lip trembling with disappointment. "Come here, little man," Tucker said, scooping the baby up once more. "Your mama and I have some news for you. How would you like to make this arrangement permanent?" James responded by grabbing Tucker's nose, eliciting a laugh from both adults. "I'll take that as approval," Tucker declared, wrapping his free arm around Felicity's waist and drawing her close. "A family. Our family." The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church where they had been attending services. It was a simple ceremony, attended by a few of Tucker's colleagues from the marshal's office and their wives, along with several neighbors who had become friends over the past months. Felicity wore a dress of pale blue muslin that she had sewn herself, with a sprig of white wildflowers in her dark hair. Tucker, resplendent in his best suit, waited for her at the altar with barely contained emotion, James perched on his hip. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Tucker's kiss was both reverent and possessive, drawing a few chuckles and a smattering of applause from the small gathering. As they turned to face their friends as Mr. and Mrs. Ainsworth, Felicity felt a sense of completion she had never thought possible. A circle closed, a journey ended and another begun. The reception was held at their home, with tables set up in the backyard amid Felicity's flourishing garden. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the gathering. Tucker kept Felicity close to his side throughout the evening, his hand rarely leaving hers, as if reassuring himself that she was real, that this happiness was not a dream that might vanish with the morning light. When the last guest had departed, and James had been tucked into bed in what would now be his own room, the smallest of the upstairs bedrooms, which Felicity had lovingly decorated with blue curtains, and a colorful quilt, Tucker led his bride to the master bedroom that had been hers since her arrival in Paris. "I had Mrs. Peterson bring some of my things up earlier," he explained somewhat awkwardly, indicating the shaving stand now positioned near the wash basin and his reading spectacles on the bedside table. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion." Felicity smiled, touched by his consideration even now. "It's your room too, Tucker. Your home, our home." He nodded, drawing her into his arms with a tenderness that made her heart swell. "Our home," he repeated, his voice husky. "I like the sound of that." Their kiss deepened, months of restrained desire finally finding expression in the privacy of their shared bedroom. When Tucker's lips traced a path from her mouth to her neck, Felicity sighed with pleasure, her hands threading through his dark hair. "I love you," she whispered as he lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bed. "I have for so long. And I you," Tucker murmured against her skin. "From the moment you looked up at me on that auction platform with such courage despite your fear." He laid her gently on the quilt, his gaze traveling over her face with wonder. "I knew then that you were someone extraordinary." As they came together as husband and wife for the first time, Felicity marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment, from the degradation of the auction block to the sanctity of marriage, from strangers to lovers, from solitary souls to family. It was a path neither could have foreseen, yet one that now seemed inevitable, as if all the hardships and joys had been leading to this union of hearts and lives. Later, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Tucker's steady heartbeat beneath her cheek, Felicity felt a peace she had never known before, a certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, strengthened by the love they had found against all odds. "What are you thinking?" Tucker asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Felicity smiled against his chest. "I was thinking about the day James was born, how frightened I was, how certain I was that he and I were doomed to a life of servitude." She propped herself up on an elbow to look into his face, And then you appeared like some avenging angel and changed everything." Tucker's expression softened with memory. "I was just passing through Coolidge, almost didn't stop at all." His hand cupped her cheek. "But something made me ride into town that day instead of taking the trail around it." "Providence, maybe. Or fate," Felicity suggested. "Or fate," he agreed, pulling her down for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. As spring gave way to summer, the Ainsworth household settled into a rhythm of domestic happiness that neither Tucker nor Felicity had dared to imagine for themselves. Tucker continued his work as marshal, but made a point of being home for supper most evenings and spending Sundays with his family. Felicity maintained the house and garden, now with the assistance of a young girl from town who came in 3 days a week to help with the heavier work. James, thriving under the love and attention of both parents, took his first steps on a warm June afternoon, toddling determinedly from Felicity to Tucker with a look of triumph on his face that had them both laughing with delight. "He has your determination," Tucker observed as James turned around and attempted the journey in reverse. "And your stubbornness," Felicity countered with a smile. "He hasn't stopped trying since he pulled himself up on the sofa last week." Tucker caught the boy as he wobbled, lifting him high in the air to James's shrieking delight. "That's my son," he declared proudly, "never giving up." The word son no longer carried any qualification in their household. Though everyone in Paris knew that James was not Tucker's biological child, the Marshal had legally adopted him shortly after the wedding, ensuring that James Tucker Ormond Ainsworth would have all the rights and protections of a legitimate heir. The summer passed in a haze of contentment, marked by small joys and shared moments. James's growing vocabulary, Sunday picnics by the creek, evenings on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. Felicity sometimes found herself pausing in the midst of household tasks, overcome by the simple happiness of their life together. It was during one such moment in late August, as she stood at the kitchen window watching Tucker teach James how to feed the chickens, that she felt the first flutter deep in her belly, a sensation she recognized from her pregnancy with James. She pressed a hand to her abdomen, a smile spreading across her face. That evening, after James had been put to bed, she joined Tucker on the porch swing, nestling against his side as was their custom. "Good day," he asked, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. "The best," she replied, taking his free hand and guiding it to rest on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Tucker went utterly still for a moment, then turned to look at her, his expression one of stunned joy. "A baby, you're sure?" Felicity nodded, her eyes shining. "Not absolutely certain yet, but I recognize the signs. I think he or she will arrive next spring, around April." Tucker's face broke into a radiant smile as he pulled her into his arms, his kiss fervent with happiness. "Another child," he marveled when they parted. "Our child." "Our child," Felicity echoed, resting her head on his shoulder as they resumed their gentle swinging. "James will be a wonderful big brother." Tucker was silent for a moment, his hand protectively covering her abdomen. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted quietly. "A wife, children, a real family, not with my work the dangers. Yet here we are," Felicity said, covering his hand with her own. "And I wouldn't change a thing about the path that brought us together. Not even the auction block." Tucker asked, his voice holding a trace of the old anger at what she had endured. Felicity considered this, then shook her head. "Not even that. Because without that moment, as terrible as it was, we might never have met. You might never have carried me away from there. You might never have delivered our James." She pressed a kiss to his jaw, now smooth from his evening shave. "Every step, every hardship led me to you, Let us hear." Tucker's arms tightened around her, his expression solemn in the fading light. "I promise you, Felicity Ainsworth, that for as long as I live, you and our children will never know want or fear or loneliness again." It was a vow he would keep through all the years that followed through the birth of their daughter, Hannah, the following spring, through James's growth into a studious, thoughtful young man who would eventually follow in Tucker's footsteps as a lawman, through the arrival of two more sons, Michael and Benjamin, who would help turn their modest property into one of the most prosperous small farms in the county. And on warm summer evenings, long after the children were grown and had families of their own, Tucker and Felicity could still be found on that same porch swing, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the fireflies rise from the garden she had planted so many years before, a garden that, like their love, had taken root in unlikely soil and flourished beyond all expectations.